Welcome to another Red Dice Diaries RPG review video, and in this video I'm reviewing the 13th Age game published by Pelgrane Press and written by Rob Heinsu and Jonathan Tweet. Now, the introduction of this book doesn't waste a lot of time on easing people into the idea of role-playing, and to quote the book itself, we have targeted the game towards experienced games masters and players at all levels of role-playing experience. So the game sort of assumes a familiarity with role-playing to a certain degree. It doesn't really give you that whole "what is role-playing" paragraph that's come to be known as standard in pretty much any RPG you care to mention. Now, this game is written by people who are involved in both the 3rd and 4th editions of D&D, and they say in their introduction that critics said that 3rd edition D&D weighed the game down with rules for everything, and that 4th edition was compared to a miniatures or tactical war game. And 13th Age attempts to straddle the line between those two, taking on the best elements of the two editions, sorry, and leaving behind some of the perceived weaknesses. The introduction also contains a brief description of icons, one of the more interesting new additions to this game, and one which they go on to in some length across multiple chapters in the book. And these are archetypal NPCs that characters can build relationships with, that can act as patrons of players, adventure hooks, etc. They sort of occupy a position similar to clans in Vampire the Masquerade or tribes in Werewolf, etc. A sort of a group you can pledge your allegiance to, sort of thing. There's also a breakdown of the chapters listed in the introductions, and the game's very clear that individual elements from 13th Age can be ported into other OGL games and vice versa. Okay, so we move on to Chapter 1, which is all about the icons that I've previously mentioned. And that's 13, in this case, powerful NPCs that shape the world from behind the scenes. And these vary from the Dwarven King to the Lich King to the Elf Queen, the Imperial Emperor, the Golden Dragon, etc. All of which are quite an interesting mix of good and evil NPCs, and they all have very compelling relationships to each other. Although they are tied to a certain extent into the book's default campaign setting, and I've got the feeling that they may require some tweaking or additions if you're going to use them with a homebrew campaign setting. The first chapter provides details on these iconic NPCs and how their interests may intersect with those of the players. Now, if you've played earlier editions of D&D, a couple of these NPCs, for instance the Lich Lord with his false hand and his gem for an eye, may seem extremely familiar to you. However, that's hardly surprising given that the writers have worked on previous editions of D&D, nor do I feel that it detracts from their value in this instance. Chapter 2 heads on to the character rules, and this is a fairly standard character creation chapter for anyone who's familiar with D&D, although the default assumption here is that you will be using a point buy system rather than the more traditional dice rolling systems used in other editions of D&D. There is one small exception, that multi-classing is labelled as firmly not supported in this book, although it does mention that they're going to support it in future supplements, and there is a fairly decent workaround suggested in the book. So I don't see that being a major problem. Characters have what is known as recovery dice, which are reminiscent of the healing surges in 4th edition D&D, allowing PCs to recover a discrete amount of hit points or health at certain points of the adventure without having to go through the long rest periods that can often cause an adventure to seem a little bit choppy and break them up and sort of ruin the tension in previous editions of D&D. It just allows you to keep the game going for a little longer before the party have to rest, which can only be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. And healing surge is one of my favourite elements of 4th edition. Now, one of my favourite bits of this session is that it encourages the player to come up with one unique thing about their character. Now, this is a brief story hook that separates that particular character from other people in the setting. And I think that's a great thing. It reminds me very much of the aspects in the Fate system, and it does seem that the game is trying to pull in several more story-based ideas and sort of link them up with the more familiar D&D system, which is also something I've seen happening in D&D Next via the playtest materials, and it seems to be a general trend amongst role-play games nowadays to feature more story-based mechanics, something I'm greatly in favour of. Now, this chapter goes into more detail about the icons and how the relationships with player characters can spur on plot. It's interesting, however, it does seem to suffer a bit from that roll a bucket load of dice and note stuff down before you start the game syndrome that I'm not a massive fan of. Characters in this game do not pick skills like in D&D. What they do is they create backgrounds that they assign a certain number of points to. Backgrounds can be pretty much anything from Imperial Mage, Warrior of the Red Tooth Tribe, Lonesome Assassin, pretty much whatever you want. And when you make a roll, you add up the modifiers for any applicable backgrounds and add them to the roll of a d20, which I think is a great simple system and reminds me very much of the approaches from Fate Accelerated, and it's possibly something I'll be looking to port into my own Fate games in the future. It's also a great advocate of a concept that I've seen in a few other games, the fail forward concept. Now, this is an idea that when a player gets lower than the required number on a dice roll, rather than simply as the GM say, no, you failed the roll, bad times, what you actually do is you allow the action, the conflict to succeed to a certain extent. However, because of the low roll, you assign a cost or a price to it. And I think this is a good idea because it allows a story to keep flowing forward rather than hitting a brick wall simply because the player's got a bad roll. And it also softens the whole sort of failure element of the game. I mean, let's face it, no one likes having an amazing score at a particular ability and getting to that final throw of the dice in a dramatic plot line, then suddenly, just because of bad luck, the whole thing falls apart. Anybody got time for that in their role-playing games? It's, in my opinion, one of the worst things that can happen in a game. And there's various systems that have been proposed in other games to deal with this, and I think the fail forward advice is as good if not better than any of these suggestions. That moves us on to chapter 3, which is the races section of the book, and the races are mostly standard and will be familiar to anyone who plays D&D. They all have various ability modifiers and they each have a particular race power that can be used once a scene. The write-ups of the race backgrounds are a little short for my liking, to be perfectly honest, and very to the point, but they do suggest some interesting background traits for use with the various races, and I'm pretty sure that these will be expanded upon in future supplements, as tends to be the way with things. There's some interesting alternate creation ideas for half-elves and half-orcs, two of my favourite races, as a magical consequence of two empires uniting and as a supernatural response to an orc infestation, respectively, in this book. Also, there's a very interesting take on the societal split of the three peoples, or shards as they're referred to, of elves that are featured in the game. And these are the high elves, the wood elves, and the dark elves. Now, before the split of the race occurred, they occupied three tiers in the elven sacred forest. The high elves would live in towers in the canopy and at the top of the trees, peeking out into the stars and making their divinations. The wood elves would occupy and would tend to the trunks of the tree, and the dark elves would live amongst the roots. Now, and they are all ruled by a single iconic elf queen. Now, this suggests some very interesting plot ideas to me, and also it seems to create a more sort of binding element between the three aspects of the elven race that can often be missing, I feel, from some fantasy settings. The elven sub-races often feel quite divorced from each other aside from a common ancestry. However, I think the 13th Age does a fairly good job of tying them all together and making them seem like different aspects of a single race. And there's also, to finish the chapter, a handful of optional races provided. There's the Celestial Tinted Azimar, the Tiefling, there's the Dwarf Forged, which are Eberron Warforged by another name, and there's the now inevitable race of Dragon Men in there as well. And these, whilst not being particularly compelling, it's a nice inclusion for anyone who fancies playing them. Chapter 4 is classes, and there's a couple of classes notable in their absence, the most obvious being the Druid, although it has been mentioned that the Druid will be brought out in future supplements. Each class goes up to level 10, and they seem fairly solidly written with a mix of feats and selectable class abilities. Cleric deities seem a little bit sketchy for my liking, and the game seems to use a variant of the D&D domain system, which I'm not particularly keen on. I prefer a bit more variation amongst priests in my game, but if you like that sort of thing, that's grand, more power to you. The classes seem to be built with the idea of customization in mind from the very start, and rather than having a set repertoire of class abilities, players get to pick from an assortment of different abilities that they acquire as they go up in level. This seems like a great idea for me, and it means that you can't simply rely on the fact that every single paladin, fighter, ranger, or whatever is going to have the same set of abilities. And why would you? Not everyone who has a job in the real world has exactly the same skill set. And I think a bit of variation is always good to liven up a game. Cantrips, always one of my favourite aspects of spellcasting in D&D, are now an ability that wizards can perform in addition to their normal spells so many times a day. This is quite a cool mechanic, and it basically means that when you're a wizard, once you've spuffed all of your main spells, you still got a fair sort of decent arsenal of little nifty abilities that you can call on to help you out of a jam. And it means that you're not just stood at the back sort of scuffing your heels and being pretty damn useless. Spells do not vanish from the mind automatically when they are cast, but they have a limited usage, very much like the powers in D&D 4th edition. And they also seem to have taken the concept of rituals from D&D 4th edition. I'd have to see how this plays in game more before I completely made up my mind about it. However, I've never been a particularly massive fan of the Vancian system, the traditional D&D spell system where spells disappear out of your mind when they're cast. However, some people do like that, and I think it'd be fairly easy to run the game in that fashion if you wanted to, or to use different rules if you should prefer. Chapter 5 is a fairly standard D&D combat chapter. There's not much remarkable here, and there's a fair few little tweaks and alterations which just sort of polish off the rough edges of combat. Crits are now automatic on a roll of a 20, and they just do double damage. There's no having to roll again for your crit threshold or anything silly like that. There's an optional meaningful death rule that I quite like, which says that PCs can only be killed by named monsters, i.e. important NPCs or an important encounter. When they're killed by generic monsters, they're actually just knocked out for the duration of the combat. Now, this is a great rule since there is a meaningful consequence to being taken out in a combat. However, it does reduce the likelihood that your mighty warrior is accidentally going to get clipped by the arrow from some spotty low-level goblin and through sheer misfortune get taken out, which is a completely non-heroic way to go when you could be slogging it out with some archfiend from hell or the major bad guy of the campaign or something similar. And I know which way I'd rather go out, to be perfectly honest. Now, there's also a rule called the Escalation Dice, which is a rule system that I quite like, and that I'll probably be adapting for use in some of my other games. And this rule system basically says that starting on the second round of a combat, all players, although not NPCs and monsters, receive a +1 modifier to their attack roll. This modifier goes up by 1 on the following rounds, either until the combat ends or there's a meaningful break in combat, up to a maximum of +6. And this represents the building momentum of a combat, and it also, I think, would help prevent combats becoming bogged down into some sort of slogfest with just endless dice rolls taking up an awful lot of time, which, let's face it, isn't really fun beyond a certain point for anybody involved in a game. They also introduce the concept of quick rests, which are effectively a way of regaining some hit points and recharging some of your powers without taking the lengthy full rest of 8 hours or so that's normally been required in previous editions. Chapter 6 is all about running the game, and it has yet more information on icon relationships, although again this seems to come down to rolling a load of dice either at the start or the end of a session. There's a bit of advice on the different environs of the 3 tiers of play, which are Adventurer, Champion and Epic tier. I'm not really sure how much I agree with this, since I think any environment could suit the different tiers as long as the GM preparing the game has prepared his game sufficiently and has taken into account what level the players are. But there is some well-written advice in this chapter on creating encounters that I can see being quite useful, especially for those who aren't as comfortable with running an encounter on the fly, for instance, or who want a more balanced experience in their game. Chapter 7 is the Monsters or Bestiary chapter, and it's a fairly well written but standard bestiary chapter containing all of the usual suspects from a D&D game. It contains some nice information on mooks, which are the generic henchmen of the monster world, and they fall easily and in great swathes before the player. This is a concept used in a lot of different games, and the designers of 13th Age even mention that they were inspired by this concept in Feng Shui, and it's a great idea. Let's face it, when have you ever seen a fantasy film or read a fantasy book where the great and noble hero is forced to spend days slogging their way through nameless henchmen? Far better, in my opinion, to get through those nameless henchmen quickly and get onto the real sort of meat of an encounter, whether that be a combat or something else. The monster entries are a little short on ecology and background information from myself. I don't know whether this is because they intend to follow the standard D&D model and release their own bestiary, and that this is just a stopgap measure, or whether it's simply because they assume that people will have that background in D&D and will already know about these creatures. The information mostly concerns how they relate to one or another of the archetypal icons of the game. But the chapter does round off with an extremely useful section of information about creating monsters from scratch yourself, and I think this would be very useful for GMs planning on running this game. Chapter 8 is the default setting of the book, which is the Dragon Empire, and it's a fairly generic fantasy world, which the main positive of it, as I can see, is that there's plenty of blank space for you to expand into and to add your own ideas into. The entries on cities and areas are to the point and extremely brief, but there are some interesting ideas in there, such as hellholes, areas that have become literally hells on earth, and there's the now obligatory information about how icons relate to all of this. And indeed, like all of the chapters before this, they really seem keen on pushing that whole icon approach to things, which is understandable given that they hope it'll occupy a position similar to those of clans in vampire games, for example. Chapter 9 is about magic items, and there's nothing particularly surprising in this chapter. It's solidly written though. There's a number of examples of magic items. It'll be nothing surprising to anyone who's read any edition of D&D, or indeed any fantasy game or equipment guide. However, I do enjoy the fact that the default game has an assumption that magic items will be something of a rarity, and that you won't be able to simply go to a magic item vendor and purchase them, which is something that I think is a very good idea, since rendering anything commonplace tends to remove the sense of wonder and the sense of mysticism about it, something which is essential to keep that spark of magic going in a fantasy campaign. Chapter 10 is titled Blood and Lightning, and it's a sample adventure for the setting, so I won't give away too many details in case anyone wants to run it. However, it's a short adventure that does a good job of highlighting some of the new mechanics, particularly how to deal with the icons and using them as plot hooks. So, in conclusion, this is an extremely interesting book that's well written and illustrated. My only issue is that I don't know if it's different enough from D&D that I'd run it as a whole game itself. Now, it may become more distinct from D&D when further expansions are released, but at the minute it doesn't seem there's enough new meat in there for me to want to run it as an entire book itself. However, I would certainly recommend some of the mechanics out of the book. For instance, there's the escalation dice I talked about earlier. There's the background traits that I talked about, and a few other things which I think would make great elements to be imported into any D&D or indeed fantasy game. The print copy seems a little on the expensive side for what you're getting, to my mind. However, the PDF costs far less and is certainly worth a look. So, to wrap up this review, as I say, it's an interesting book with some interesting elements. I don't think I'd run it on its own as a game at present. However, I'm certainly glad to have got a copy of it and will be taking several of the newer rules elements for use in my games. So, if you're interested in any of these optional rule mechanics or seeing how a D&D game can be altered or given a different flavour, I recommend you give it a look. Now, if you have any comments about 13 Age or about this view, please leave them in the comments box below. I hope if you've enjoyed this video, you'll consider subscribing to my channel, and I look forward to reading what you've written. Thanks very much for watching.